Merry Christmas. What do you mean when you say that? I don't think it means what you think it means. I mean, we know it's a cordial greeting. We know it is a polite acknowledgement of this season. And for those of you who are more irritable, it can be a political statement. I'm not saying happy holidays, saying Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. But for most of us, I think it's far more than just a polite greeting. It's an expression of something more than that. I think it's an expression of the season. It's an expression of our desire. It's an expression of our hope. It's an expression of the joy and the celebration and invitation. It's a blessing. And for many of us, it is a reminder of the uniqueness of this time of year, of what we are celebrating in this season. It's an expression of our hope for our lives and the lives of those we greet. But for some of you, it's not any of that. It is, in fact, a provocation. It is an antagonism. Because every time you hear the words Merry Christmas, you are reminded of what has been lost, of what you cannot have, of who is not here. And it's anything but a Merry Christmas when you are relentlessly reminded of your pain, when that wound is constantly reopened, and you are revisiting the sorrow and the grief and the loss that is heightened in this season. Last week we began a conversation about one of the most misunderstood stories of Christmas, the story of the wise men, the story of the Magi. And it has become so embellished over the years that it's difficult for us to determine, unless we go back to the original story in the Gospel of Matthew in the 2nd chapter, to really discern what do we know about these people. We don't know exactly where they were from. We certainly don't know how many of them. We don't know their names. We don't know how long they traveled. We don't know how they discovered the star. We don't really know any of the details of their journey. We only know that when they arrived, they worshiped this one who they believed was the promised deliverer, and they presented him with 3 small gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And last week, I suggested that we not focus on those 3 gifts, but the gift behind the gifts, the gift of their presence. That it was their presence that was the greatest gift. And in their presence, they were giving faith and hope and love, not just to the newborn king, but to all of us. For our presence is the greatest gift that we can give, and faith, hope, and love are the greatest gifts that we can get or give to another. And so today, in the complex feelings of the season of a Merry Christmas, I want us to celebrate, and I want us to consider the power of the presence of hope and what it means to give that gift. But before we talk about that, would you pray with me for a moment? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your word spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to remind us of the priceless hope we have and the power we have to share that with others. Pray that we would celebrate it and share it today together in this place. For I ask that in Jesus' name, amen. 600 years before the birth of Christ, 605 years to be precise, was a dark season in the history of the people of God. In 605 BC, the city of Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonian armies under King Nebuchadnezzar. In the fall of 605 BC, Jerusalem was torn down to its foundations, and the remnants of the Jewish nation were carried off into exile, into captivity, into slavery. Among those who were enslaved 600 years before the birth of Christ was a young man named Daniel and 3 of his friends. They were men of such outstanding character that they quickly distinguished themselves in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel spent most of his life in exile as an expatriate Hebrew slave, as an advisor and a counselor to the kings. For over 60 years, he was a spiritual advisor, a wise counsel to the kings of Babylon. In fact, it was near the end of his life in 539 BC. In fact, it was October of 539 BC. In fact, it was the evening of October the 12th, 539 BC. That the king of Babylon, named Belshazzar, had gathered his royal entourage for a large party when suddenly and mysteriously handwriting appeared on the wall. Of course, he sought out his counselors to discern what this handwriting meant, but it was only his wise counselor Daniel who could interpret the handwriting on the wall, and he told Belshazzar that the words, "Mene, mene, tekel upharsin," meant you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting, and your kingdom will come to an end this very evening. The archaeological records tell us that Darius the Medes and the army of the Persians invaded the capital of Babylon and overthrew it in one day, thus establishing Medo-Persian rule and the birth of the Persian Empire throughout the Middle East. Daniel was a man of such commendable character that rather than being classified as a former counselor, he was elevated to become the counselor now of the Persian kings. And it was 1 year after the overthrow of the Babylonians, as Daniel began his tenure as a counselor to the Persians, that he had a troubling vision. It was a vision of the kings that were to come, and they were characterized as beasts. But at the end of his vision, after these horrifying beasts had appeared, one appeared in the clouds. And Daniel was revealed a calendar that said that the kingdom of heaven will be established after 70 weeks of 7. And these 70 weeks of 7 years would begin, it tells us in Daniel chapter 9, after the decree to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. So that after 69 weeks of years, the anointed one would come, and the world would see the face of its deliverer. Daniel was troubled by this vision, but he recorded it, and it entered into the annals of the history of the region of the Medes and the Persians, of the Babylonians. You see, Daniel was a forerunner of the Magi. 600 years before the time of Christ, the wise counselors, the wise men of the East, were populated by Hebrew expatriates and one man named Daniel. Undoubtedly, his writing was preserved in oral traditions and in cuneiform tablets, and it's not unreasonable to assume that 600 years after, or 500 years after Daniel's lifetime, that the Magi of the Far East studied these legends and myths and writings. And they began to make the calculations that said, I wonder how long these 70 weeks of years are. What was the end of the 69th week? And the historical evidence pointed back to the year 444 BC. When the king Artaxerxes, 100 years after the death of Daniel, proclaimed that the Jewish people should return to the land and rebuild the city of Jerusalem. It was the calculation that 444 years before the time of the Magi, that this proclamation was made, and they could do the math. And it is not irrational to imagine that this group of wise men reading the writings of Daniel, doing the calculations, realized that they were living within a window of the lifetime of the one who was promised to come after the 69 weeks of years. You see, they were hoping for what every man is hoping for what all of us are hoping for a second chance, hoping for a new day, hoping for a better world. And the promise of that hope drove them halfway across the world to find this promised Messiah, this newborn king. It was their hope that drove them. It was their hope that carried them. It was their hope that brought them to the feet of the newborn king. It was their hope that they brought in their presence. Now, hope is something that we talk about all the time. We use the word hope very freely, very easily, and we think we understand hope, but we really don't. We kind of know when we have hope or when we don't have hope. We know when we find hope and when we lose hope. But what is hope really? How do you define it? Defining hope is kind of like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. It's trying to fill your hands with smoke. Hope always defies a limited definition. We know that it's bad when you lose hope. We know that it's dangerous to have a false hope. We know that we are warned at times to avoid having our hopes set too high. But we really don't know what hope means. I actually did a doctoral dissertation on the Pauline theology of hope. I wrote a book about hope. I've preached dozens of messages on hope, but I can't tell you that I can define it, because hope is a both-and concept in an either-or world. Hope is a paradox. You see, hope never arrives. Because when hope arrives, hope ends. Because we have what we hope for. Hope is always in the future. Hope is always yet to come. Hope is a paradox. It is complex, and yet it is essential. And it is at the core of the message of Christmas. Today I want to share with you three lessons that I learned from the Magi about hope. Three lessons about hope and the paradox and the complexity of hope. The first lesson that I learned from the Magi about hope was that hope is always beyond today. Hope is always beyond today. It is always in the future. It is always ahead. But it is never without a promise. Hope is always beyond today, but it is never without a promise. The Magi were clinging to a promise that was 600 years old. They were clinging to a prophecy that had preceded them by hundreds of generations. They reorganized their lives and traveled halfway across the known world because of a hope. It was a hope and a promise that guided Mary through her pregnancy, through all of the difficulties and the challenges of that. It was her hope, the promise that she had been given, that this was no ordinary child, that guided her through the raising of her son, that guided her through the difficulties and challenges of her life. It was that hope and that promise that guided her through the years of his ministry and guided her through his death and guided her through his resurrection. You see, hope is what sustains us. Hope is what anchors us. The promise of hope is what sustains us and strengthens us to get through to tomorrow. It is hope that moves us forward. It is hope that encourages us and affirms us. Are any of you impatient? Am I the only one who's impatient in this room? Am I the only one that gets impatient in the Austin traffic, that says this traffic exists just to frustrate me? Am I the only one who's impatient and thinks a microwave anymore is absolutely glacial and how long it takes to pop popcorn? 3 minutes? Can't we invent an instant popping popcorn? That when I search on Google, if it takes more than a nanosecond to give me 1.1 million answers to my question, I'm frustrated with the speed or the lack of speed of the internet? Now, we may think that we are living in an increasingly impatient culture because of the speed of the world that we live in. We may believe that the world that we live in is growing increasingly impatient because of our frustration with the speed of life, when in the reality what is happening is it is revealing the frailty of our hope. Because the more confidence we have in our hope, the more patient we can be, the more generous we can be, the longer we can wait because of the confidence in our hope. That's the paradox of hope. The paradox of hope is that it never arrives, and the more you have of it, the more you're willing to wait for it. The paradox of our hope is that it is always beyond today, but it is never without a promise. So how do we give hope to others in this season of hope? How do we make hope real? There's one simple way: keep your promises. When we keep our promises, we keep hope alive. We actually strengthen the hope of others when we keep our promises. First thing I learned about this confusing subject of hope is that it's always beyond today. The second thing I learned about it is that it's always beyond figuring out, but it's never without evidence. Now, that evidence is generally forensic. That evidence is generally very thin. Hope does not need an abundance of evidence. The smallest thread of evidence, the slightest evidence that is even invisible to the naked eye, to the common person, that is beyond our logic, even that evidence is enough to build our hope. Her name was Vi. When I met her, she was in her mid-80s. And she was one of the most feisty and independent women that I have ever met. And she was one of the great prayer warriors that I have known in my life. If you ever walked up to Vi and said, "Hey, Vi, would you pray for me?" she would do it right there. She would grab your hands and pray. And there were a number of times when I had the privilege of actually sitting down and praying with her. And every time we prayed together, she would pray for her husband. You see, Vi was never married, and she was well into her 80s when I met her. And oftentimes she would be praying for the husband that God had promised her. Now, I never had the conversation with Vi saying, "Vi, don't you think it's a little bit irrational? Because the market for eligible men in your age group is really thin. And if you haven't found somebody by now, I think your hope is kind of irrational." But Vi would always say, "This is my hope. I live for this hope." And she held on to this hope even beyond the time that I knew her. She moved away a number of years later and went to live with her family out of state. And I would imagine that at this point she has attended the wedding feast of the Lamb. And she was recognized as the bride of Christ. But I could not dissuade her from her hope. Just the slightest bit of evidence of the faithfulness of God was enough to sustain her hope. It was enough to sustain Mary through the challenges of this season. It was enough to move the Magi from their homes in the east on a quest to find this newborn king, because all the Magi had was a star. The only evidence they had was a single star. Have you been outside and seen the stars? There's lots of them. If you haven't noticed, there's probably more than you can count. So one new one really is not going to cause much of a ruckus, unless, of course, you're paying attention and you're counting stars, and that is your study. That one new star, that single point of light that easily overlooked, unnoticed phenomenon in the heavens was calling attention, and it was sufficient for the Magi to say, we will put our hope in the ancient promises that we believe of a coming deliverer because of the sign of a single star in the heavens. I like to imagine that our hope is in things that we cannot really fully comprehend. You see, their hope was in a star, and it's likely that that star was possibly a supernova, probably a star imploding, and because of the explosion of that star, it projected an unusual brightness, so what may have been invisible before was suddenly seen. And for that supernova to exist outside of our galaxy is most likely. And do you know what the closest galaxy to our own is? It's the Andromeda Galaxy. So imagine that the star that the Magi observed, that single star in the sky, that just happened to be observable in that one moment in human history, that star was a supernova in the Andromeda Galaxy. That means that 2.5 million years, because the Andromeda Galaxy is 2.5 million light years away from Earth. That means that 2.5 million years before the Magi even existed, that star was made to explode so that the light would travel through interstellar space and reach the Earth in the exact moment to call attention to the Magi, to ignite their hope, to send them to give that present to the newborn King. This is what hope does. Hope is beyond figuring out, but it is never without evidence. I've learned from the Magi that hope is beyond today. I've learned from the Magi that hope is beyond figuring out. And the third thing I've learned from the Magi is that hope is beyond sorrow. But it is not without sacrifice. Hope is beyond sorrow, but it is not without sacrifice. What does it cost to give hope to someone else? What does it cost us? It costs us something. What did it cost the Magi to travel from their homes to visit this newborn king? They couldn't exactly throw on a backpack and go on a hike halfway across the known world. They had to probably organize transportation, a caravan of some kind. They probably had a large financial stake in this adventure, in this quest. If not a stake of their reputations, for their fellow Magi may not have agreed with them and may have mocked them as they went on their way in search of this mythical king. Sometimes that's what our hope costs us. Our hope costs us the rejection of others, the mockery of others who don't understand the necessity or the strength of our hope. But hope that comes is not without sacrifice. We don't know what it cost Mary, but it probably cost her a great deal to maintain her hope. You see, as we read the story of the life of Jesus, his father, Joseph, disappears. Shortly after his dedication at 8 years old, he is no longer in the story. Mary is there. His half-brothers and sisters are there. But there is no record of Joseph. It is most likely that Mary spent much of her life as a single mother, as a widow. That she had to wait patiently while her son found his way to the beginning of his ministry. And then she had to watch as a mother and try and understand what her son was doing, and then understand why he was persecuted and crucified. And then understand the meaning and the significance of the resurrection. Her hope was challenged at every turn. Undoubtedly, her hope came at great cost. But it was a hope that went beyond her sorrow. It was a hope that saw her through. And this is the hope that we have. This is the hope that we share. The greatest way to express our hope, the greatest way to strengthen our hope is to share it with others. Because hope is active. It is not passive. Hope is something that is meant to be given away. It is meant to be given to those who have lost theirs. It is transferable. We can share our hope. even if it is simply through our presence. Hope is a complicated thing, and the Magi help me understand the nature of hope, the paradox of hope, that hope is already and not yet, that hope is difficult to define, that hope is supposed to be. It is supposed to be beyond our understanding, beyond definition. It is supposed to sustain us when nothing else will. This is the nature of hope. This is what we celebrate in this season, and this is why hope is so powerful. This is why I believe it is what the presence of the Magi at the foot of the newborn king was one of the great gifts that they presented. They presented hope. They presented hope, the hope of mankind, the hope to Mary and Joseph, the hope of their hearts. In the story of the Magi, they gave him more than gold and frankincense and myrrh. They gave him their hope. It had been 600 years since the life of Daniel, and Daniel had lived a life of a slave in exile in Babylon as a counselor to the kings and as a counselor to the rulers of Babylon and Persia. He had many visions that were recorded in his writings, what we have as the book of Daniel, what the Magi probably had as oral traditions, if not written on cuneiform tablets. And one of his most powerful prophecies came in the first year of Belshazzar the king, when he had a troubling vision of the four kingdoms that would come that he describes as beasts. And then after seeing these four beastly kingdoms, he sees what he describes in Daniel chapter 7 as the coming of the Son of Man in the clouds of heaven. And he approached the Ancient of Days and came into his presence. And the hope of Daniel and the hope of the Magi and our hope was in the image of this one being given all power and glory, and that every tongue and every language would worship him, and his kingdom would never end. As the Magi came and as they fell at the feet of the newborn Savior, I believe that they were worshiping this one who was their hope. That as they presented him with their gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh, they were presenting him with the gift of their hope. And this is what I mean when I say Merry Christmas. May you experience the hope that has been given to us. May you experience the hope of a better day, of a better version of ourselves, of a better world, of a kingdom that will know no end. Seated around us today are those who are struggling to hold on to their hope, whose hope has been challenged and beaten and torn asunder. So that when we say Merry Christmas, we are not simply exchanging a polite greeting. We are pronouncing a blessing. We are making our hope available. And I would encourage you, before you leave today, before you leave this campus, as we greet one another with many Merry Christmases, to be very mindful of those who need not just to hear it, but to experience it in our presence, the great presence of our hope, simply expressed in Mary